31 of the finest doctors in the country stood inside a private ICU suite, and not one of them could explain why Linda Randy was dying. Every test contradicted the last. Every treatment failed. The CEO of a billion-dollar empire was slipping away under fluorescent lights while the most decorated physicians in the state argued in circles. Then a black man in a wrinkled flannel shirt, a single father who had wandered in from the pediatric ward, stepped forward and said 7 words that silenced the room. "I know what's killing her." They laughed. They should not have. Before we dive in, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments. And if you're new here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss how this story ends. Trust me, you're going to want to stay for this one. The children's ward at St. Albans Private Hospital smelled like antiseptic and apple juice. Dennis Hill sat on the edge of a narrow cot, his daughter's small hand curled around his index finger. Mia was 7. She had her mother's wide brown eyes and her father's stubborn jaw, and right now both features were softened by sleep. The sickle cell crisis had hit 3 days ago, the worst one yet. Her hemoglobin had dropped to 5.8, and for 11 hours, Dennis had watched the nurses cycle in and out with transfusion bags while his daughter shivered under a thin hospital blanket. He had not left her side except to use the bathroom. His phone had 17 missed calls from his supervisor at the building where he worked maintenance. He would deal with that later, or he would not. There was no version of the world where Dennis Hill left this room while his daughter still had an IV in her arm. He reached over and adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. On the nightstand sat a worn copy of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, its spine cracked from years of bedtime readings. Mia always asked for the same chapter, the one where Dorothy realizes she had the power to go home all along. Dennis never told her why that chapter made his throat tighten. Denise would have known what to say right now. Denise always knew what to say. But Denise had been dead for 5 years, killed by a tumor no one had thought to look for. 2 floors above the pediatric ward in the VIP wing that most hospital staff had never set foot in controlled chaos was unfolding. Linda Randy, 58 years old chief executive officer of Randy Graves Industries, ranked 14th on Forbes' list of the most powerful women in business, had been airlifted in 9 hours earlier after collapsing during a board meeting. The initial reports were alarming, but vague blood pressure spiking to 240/130, then crashing to 80/50 within minutes. Heart rate swinging wildly between 40 and 160. Profuse sweating. A headache so severe she had vomited before losing consciousness. The VIP suite looked less like a hospital room and more like a luxury hotel that happened to have medical equipment. Marble floors, a sitting area with leather chairs, a window overlooking downtown. None of it mattered now. Linda lay in the center of it all, intubated, sedated, her skin the color of old paper monitors, screaming numbers that made no sense to anyone watching. Her husband, Richard Randy, stood by the window with his arms crossed and his tie loosened. He had not spoken in 2 hours. Beside him, Linda's chief of staff, a sharp woman named Claire Dawson, was on her 4th phone call with the company's board of directors. The stock had already dipped 3% on rumors that something was wrong with the CEO. If Linda died, the number would be closer to 15. The hospital's chief medical officer, Dr. James Alcott, had made the calls personally. Within 6 hours, 31 specialists had assembled: cardiologists, neurologists, endocrinologists, infectious disease experts, nephrologists, toxicologists. They came from 3 different states. 2 of them had literally stepped off planes. The hospital was billing Linda's insurance at a rate that would make most families lose their homes, and it was worth every cent if these minds could figure out what was killing her. They could not. Dr. Robert Price, head of cardiology, was convinced it was a cardiac event hypertensive emergency complicated by an underlying arrhythmia. He ordered intravenous labetalol. Linda's blood pressure stabilized for 20 minutes, then crashed again, worse than before. Dr. Ann Lester from neurology argued for a hemorrhagic stroke, possibly masked by the cardiac symptoms. A CT scan showed nothing. An MRI showed nothing. She ordered a lumbar puncture anyway, and the results came back clean. Dr. William Chambers, the infectious disease specialist, raised the possibility of sepsis from an unknown source. Blood cultures were drawn. Broad-spectrum antibiotics were started. Linda did not improve. By the 8th hour, the specialists had fractured into camps. 3 separate whiteboards had been rolled into the adjacent conference room, each covered in competing theories and conflicting timelines. Voices were rising. Egos were colliding. Dr. Harrison Wells, the senior attending and the hospital's most published physician, had taken unofficial command of the room, dismissing theories with the confidence of a man who had never been wrong in his life. He was leaning toward a rare autoimmune vasculitis, but could not explain why Linda's catecholamine markers were behaving erratically. No one could explain anything. That was the problem. Meanwhile, Linda's kidneys were beginning to fail. Dennis first heard about the VIP patient from a nurse named Dolores. She had come to check Mia's IV line around 11 at night and mentioned casually that the whole hospital was in an uproar. Some rich woman upstairs was dying and nobody could figure out why. Dennis had nodded politely and said nothing. It was after midnight when Mia woke up crying. The pain was back, a deep, grinding ache in her bones that the medication could only dull, never erase. Dennis held her rocking, gently humming a song Denise used to sing until the crying softened into whimpers and the whimpers faded into sleep. Then he eased her back onto the pillow and stepped into the hallway to find a nurse. The pediatric ward was quiet. The nurse's station was empty, a shift change maybe, or an emergency somewhere else. Dennis walked further down the corridor, turned left, then right, following the signs toward what he thought was another nurse's station. He did not realize he had crossed into the VIP wing until the carpet changed from linoleum to something soft. The conference room door was open. Not wide, just enough for sound to escape. Dennis heard the voices before he saw the faces. A dozen men and women in white coats talking over each other, throwing around terms that most people would not recognize. Dennis recognized every single one. Blood pressure paroxysms recurring every 40 to 90 minutes. Tachycardia resistant to beta blocker intervention. Renal function declining, GFR dropped to 28. Diaphoresis episodes correlating with hypertensive spikes. Dennis stopped walking. His hand found the wall and he leaned against it, suddenly unsteady. The fluorescent light above him buzzed. His mouth went dry. His heart began to pound in a way that had nothing to do with being somewhere he should not be. He had heard these exact words before, not in this hospital, not from these doctors. 5 years ago, in a county hospital on the other side of the city, a younger version of Dennis had stood in a hallway just like this one, listening to a different group of doctors list the same symptoms for a different woman. His wife, his Denise, paroxysmal hypertension, tachycardia, drenching sweats, headaches that made her scream, kidneys failing for no apparent reason, and doctors, good doctors, smart doctors running in circles because pheochromocytoma was the diagnosis nobody thought of until it was too late. Denise had died on a Tuesday. Dennis had spent every night for the next 2 years reading everything ever published about the tumor that killed her. Not because he planned to go back to medical school, he had abandoned that dream when Mia needed a full-time father. He read because the knowledge was the only thing that made the grief bearable. If he could understand exactly what had gone wrong, maybe the randomness of it would hurt less. It never hurt less, but the knowledge stayed. Now standing in the hallway of St. Albans Viv IP wing at 12:40 in the morning, Dennis heard the ghost of his wife's illness speaking through the symptoms of a woman he had never met. And he knew with the certainty of someone who had earned his understanding through the worst kind of tuition exactly what was happening inside that room. He also knew that if he walked away, there was a very good chance Linda Randy would die the same way Denise had. Dennis stood there for a long time. His hands were trembling. Every rational part of his brain told him to turn around, go back to Mia, stay in his lane. He was a maintenance worker. a single dad, a black man standing uninvited in the most expensive wing of a hospital that had never been designed for people like him. But Denise's face was right there behind his eyes, and it would not leave. He pushed the door open. The room held 14 people, a fraction of the full 31, the rest monitoring from adjacent rooms or reviewing scans remotely. They all turned. 14 pairs of eyes landed on Dennis, his faded flannel shirt, his worn jeans, his work boots still flecked with paint from a job 3 weeks ago. He looked like he had wandered in from the maintenance closet, which in a sense he had. Dr. Harrison Wells spoke first. "Sir, this is a restricted area. Are you lost?" Dennis looked at the whiteboards, at the lists of symptoms, at the crossed-out diagnoses and the question marks and the arrows pointing nowhere. Then he looked at Dr. Wells. "I think I know what she has." Silence. The kind that comes before laughter. It came. A short, incredulous breath from Dr. Price. A smirk from a resident in the corner. Dr. Wells tilted his head as though Dennis had told a joke in a language he did not quite speak. "I appreciate the concern," Wells said, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a man accustomed to dismissing people without appearing rude. "But we have the situation under control. If you could step outside, security will escort you back to wherever you need to be." "You don't have it under control," Dennis said. His voice was quiet, steady. "You've been treating her for 9 hours and she's getting worse. I know what this is because I've seen it before." Wells's warmth evaporated. He nodded to someone near the door. Within 30 seconds, a security guard appeared. Dennis felt a hand on his arm. "Sir, you need to come with me." Dennis looked back at the whiteboard one last time as he was led out. The numbers stared back at him. The answer was right there, written in symptoms that any third-year medical student would have caught if they had ever watched someone die from it. The door closed behind him. But Dennis Hill was not done. The security guard walked Dennis back to the pediatric ward without a word. At the double doors separating the VIP wing from the rest of the hospital, the guard stopped, pointed down the corridor, and said, "Stay on this side." Then he turned and left. Dennis stood in the empty hallway. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere behind him, a child was coughing in one of the rooms. Somewhere above him, a woman was dying from a disease he could name, but no one would let him speak. He went back to Mia. She was still asleep, her breathing shallow but steady, the IV drip, catching the light from the hallway. Dennis lowered himself into the chair beside her bed and pressed his palms against his eyes. His mind would not stop. The symptoms kept cycling through his head like a song he could not turn off: paroxysmal hypertension, tachycardia, diaphoresis, the classic triad, all of it pointing to the same answer that had come too late for Denise and was running out of time for Linda Randy. Morning came gray and cold through the window. Mia woke up around 7, groggy but smiling, and asked for scrambled eggs. Dennis flagged down a nurse-ordered breakfast for her and sat on the edge of the cot while she ate. He told her a story about a brave girl who traveled through a magic hospital where all the walls changed color depending on your mood. Mia laughed. It was the best sound in the world. By 8:30, he could not sit still anymore. He told Mia he was going to get coffee and stepped into the corridor. His plan was simple: find someone, anyone on Linda Randy's medical team who might actually listen. He did not have credentials. He did not have authority. But he had something none of those 31 doctors had, and it was burning a hole through his chest. The first attempt failed before it started. Dennis approached the information desk near the VIP wing entrance and asked to speak with someone on Mrs. Randy's care team. The receptionist, a young woman with perfect posture and a polite, immovable smile, asked for his name and affiliation. When Dennis said he was a parent from the pediatric ward, her expression shifted into something he recognized immediately. It was the look people gave when they were about to say no while pretending they were saying something else. "I'm sorry, sir. Only authorized personnel and family members are permitted access to patient information. I can direct you to the general inquiry desk if you'd like." Dennis tried again at the nurse's station on the 3rd floor. Same result. Different face, same wall. A male nurse looked him up and down the flannel shirt, the work boots, and asked if he was looking for the facilities department. It was not cruelty. That was the thing Dennis had learned long ago. Most of the time, it was not even conscious. People simply looked at him and made a calculation based on what they saw, and what they saw was a black man in cheap clothes who obviously did not belong in the expensive part of the building. The calculation happened in less than a second. The conclusion was always the same. He was walking back toward the pediatric ward, frustration tightening his jaw, when a voice behind him said, "You're the one from last night." Dennis turned. A young woman in a white coat stood a few feet away, a tablet tucked under her arm. She was maybe 30, with dark blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, and the kind of tired eyes that came from too many overnight shifts. Her badge read, Dr. Sarah Brooks, internal medicine resident. "I saw them escort you out of the conference room," she said. Her tone was not hostile, but it was not warm either. It was careful, the voice of someone gathering information before deciding what to do with it. "You told Dr. Wells you knew what was wrong with the Randy patient." "I do," Dennis said. Dr. Brooks studied him. Based on what, Dennis told her the truth. He told her about Denise not dramatically not looking for sympathy, just the facts laid out the way you lay out a case history. His wife had died 5 years ago from an undiagnosed pheochromocytoma. The symptoms Linda Randy was presenting were identical, and the labetalol they had started was not just failing, it was actively making things worse by blocking beta receptors without addressing the alpha-mediated vasoconstriction, creating a dangerous cycle of hypertensive surges followed by hypotensive crashes. That was why Linda's kidneys were failing. She was being whipsawed to death, and the medication they chose was accelerating it. When he finished, something had shifted in Dr. Brooks' expression, not pity, not belief, but the recognition that the man standing in front of her was not delusional. He might be wrong, but he was not delusional. She was young enough to know she did not know everything, and old enough to recognize that the 31 experts upstairs had not produced a single working answer in nearly 20 hours. She was also a resident, the lowest rung on the ladder, which meant that if she brought Dennis's theory to the attending physicians, and it turned out to be nonsense, her career would take a hit she could not afford. And if she brought it, and it turned out to be right, some of those attendings would never forgive her for it. "I cannot just walk you into the conference room," she said. "Wells would have me removed from the case." "Then get me to the husband," Dennis said. "He is the one with decision-making authority. If the doctors will not listen, maybe the family will." It took Dr. Brooks 45 minutes. She made 2 phone calls and had 1 quiet conversation in a stairwell with a senior nurse she trusted. At 9:50 in the morning, Dennis found himself standing in a small waiting room on the 4th floor, face-to-face with Richard Randy. Richard looked like a man who had not slept in 30 hours, because he had not. His suit jacket was draped over a chair, his shirt was wrinkled, his eyes were red. Behind him, through a glass partition, Dennis could see the edge of the ICU suite, where Linda lay surrounded by machines. Claire Dawson. Linda's chief of staff stood beside Richard with her arms folded. She had agreed to this meeting only because Dr. Brooks had framed it carefully, a person with potentially relevant medical insight, nothing more. Claire's expression made it clear she expected this to be a waste of time. Richard looked at Dennis the way a drowning man looks at a piece of driftwood, not with hope, but with the desperate willingness to grab anything that floats. "They tell me you think you know what's wrong with my wife," Richard said. His voice was hoarse. "I don't think," Dennis said. "I know. Your wife has a pheochromocytoma, a tumor on one of her adrenal glands. It produces massive amounts of adrenaline and noradrenaline in unpredictable surges. That is why her blood pressure spikes without warning and then crashes. That is why her heart rate is erratic. That is why she is sweating through the sheets. Headache, tachycardia, diaphoresis. It is the textbook triad, and every single one of her symptoms fits." Richard shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, but in confusion. If it is that obvious, why haven't 31 doctors figured it out? Because it is rare, Dennis said. Most physicians will go their entire career without seeing a single case. And because Theo is a mimic, it looks like a cardiac emergency. It looks like a stroke. It looks like sepsis. Every specialist in that room is diagnosing from their own field. The cardiologist sees a heart problem. The neurologist sees a brain problem. Nobody is stepping back to see the whole picture. And there is something else. Dennis kept his voice level. They put her on labetalol, a beta blocker. In a Theo crisis, administering a beta blocker without first establishing alpha blockade can cause a catastrophic rebound in blood pressure. It is called unopposed alpha stimulation. It is in every endocrinology textbook. And it is actively making your wife worse right now. The room was silent. Claire Dawson had uncrossed her arms. Richard looked at Dennis for a long time. "Who are you?" "Nobody," Dennis said. "I am a maintenance worker. I am a single father. My daughter is downstairs with sickle cell disease, and that is the only reason I am in this building. But 5 years ago, my wife died of the same disease your wife has right now. The same symptoms, the same misdiagnosis, the same wrong medications. I watched it happen, and I could not stop it. I am telling you right now, you can stop it. But it has to be today. If she goes another 12 hours on this protocol, her organs will shut down, and there will be nothing left to save." Richard turned to Claire. Claire turned to Dr. Brooks, who had been standing by the door. "Is any of this possible?" Richard asked. Dr. Brooks chose her words with precision. "Pheochromocytoma is consistent with the symptom profile. It would explain the treatment resistance, and the concern about beta blocker therapy in an undiagnosed Pheo is well documented in medical literature. I cannot confirm the diagnosis without lab work, specifically plasma metanephrines and catecholamine levels, but the tests can be run in under 2 hours." Richard stood up. The driftwood had become something solid. "Get me Dr. Wells," he said, "and get those tests ordered now." The confrontation happened at 10:30 in the conference room where Dennis had been laughed out of 12 hours earlier. This time he had been invited. Dr. Brooks stood beside him. Richard Randy sat at the head of the table. 14 attending physicians lined the walls, and Dr. Harrison Wells sat directly across from Dennis with the expression of a man who had been personally insulted. Wells let Dennis speak for approximately 90 seconds before cutting him off. "With all due respect to your personal experience, Mr. Hill, this is not a diagnosis by anecdote. We have imaging lab work and the collective expertise of 31 board-certified physicians. We are pursuing autoimmune vasculitis, which is supported by the inflammatory markers." Dennis did not flinch. "Her inflammatory markers are elevated because her body has been in a catecholamine storm for over 20 hours. That is a secondary response, not a primary cause. You are treating the smoke and ignoring the fire." A murmur went through the room. Dr. Price, the cardiologist, leaned forward. "You mentioned unopposed alpha stimulation from the labetalol. Walk me through that." Dennis did, point by point. He explained how the beta blocker was lowering her heart rate, but leaving the alpha receptor-mediated vasoconstriction unchecked, creating a dangerous cycle of hypertensive surges, followed by hypotensive crashes. He cited the mechanism. He described the pathophysiology. He spoke the way someone speaks when they have read the same material 1,000 times, not with the polish of a lecturer, but with the bone-deep familiarity of a man who had memorized every word because his wife's life had depended on it. When he finished, 3 of the physicians were no longer smiling. Dr. Price was writing something down. Dr. Wells was not. "This is a waste of time," Wells said flatly. He turned to Richard. "Mr. Randy, I strongly advise against diverting resources based on the speculation of an unqualified individual." Dr. Brooks stepped forward. "The plasma metanephrine test takes 90 minutes. If the results are normal, we have lost nothing. If they are elevated, we have our diagnosis and we may still have time to save her life. The risk of running the test is 0. The risk of not running it? She let the sentence hang. Richard Randy looked at Dr. Wells, then at Dennis, then at the glass wall behind which his wife lay dying by degrees. "Run the test," Richard said. "Now." The results came back at 12:15 in the afternoon. Plasma metanephrines were elevated at more than 8 times the upper limit of normal. Free catecholamines were through the roof. The diagnosis was confirmed pheochromocytoma. Dennis Hill had been right. Every specialist in the room had been wrong. Dr. Wells said nothing. The protocol was changed immediately. Labetalol was discontinued and replaced with phenoxybenzamine, an alpha blocker to be administered before any beta blockade. The endocrinology team, which had been consulted only peripherally until now, took over primary management. For 2 hours, Linda's vitals held. Then shortly after 2 in the afternoon, everything fell apart. Her blood pressure dropped to 65/38. Her heart rate became erratic, jumping, stalling, jumping again. The monitors began screaming. Nurses rushed in. Dr. Wells pushed past Dennis in the hallway, shouting orders. The alpha blocker had opened the floodgates. Linda's vascular system, constricted for well over 20 hours by the catecholamine storm, was suddenly relaxing, and her blood volume was not enough to fill the expanded space. She was crashing. Dr. Wells wheeled on Dennis in the corridor, his face white with fury. "This is what happens when you let amateurs practice medicine. She was stable before you intervened." Richard Randy appeared in the doorway of the ICU suite. He looked at the monitors, at the doctors scrambling at his wife's body, convulsing under the hands of a crash team. Then he looked at Dennis. His eyes asked the question his mouth could not form. "What have you done?" Dennis stood in the middle of it all, the alarms, the shouting, the accusation in every pair of eyes, and felt the ground beneath him disappear. Because he had seen this before, too. He had watched Denise's numbers spiral downward on a screen just like this one. He had stood in a hallway just like this one, powerless, while the woman he loved slipped away. The difference was that this time he knew what came next, and he knew what had to be done, if anyone would let him speak. Dennis raised his voice above the alarms. "Do not switch her back." Dr. Wells was already barking orders at the nursing team to restart the labetalol drip. He did not even look at Dennis. 2 nurses were moving toward the IV stand. The crash cart had been wheeled to the bedside. Linda's blood pressure was still falling 60/34 now, and every person in the room was operating on the same instinct: undo the last thing that was changed. Dennis stepped forward close enough that Wells could not ignore him. "This is not a drug reaction. This is expected. Her vascular system has been clamped down by catecholamines for well over 20 hours. The alpha blocker is releasing that constriction, and her blood volume is not sufficient to fill the expanded vessels. She needs aggressive fluid resuscitation, normal saline wide open right now. If you put her back on the beta blocker, you will trap her in the same cycle that has been destroying her organs since she arrived. She will die tonight." Wells turned on him with barely contained rage. "You are not a physician. You have no license, no credentials, and no authority in this room. If this woman dies because of your amateur diagnosis, I will personally ensure you face criminal charges. If she dies because you restarted the labetalol, it won't be my diagnosis that killed her," Dennis said. "It will be your pride." The room went still. Even the nurses had stopped moving, their hands frozen between 2 sets of contradictory orders. The monitors continued their frantic beeping. Linda's heart rate was jumping between 50 and 120 each spike, triggering a fresh cascade of alarms. Dr. Sarah Brooks stepped into the space between Dennis and Wells. She held her tablet up so both men could see the screen. "Dr. Wells, the literature on phenoxybenzamine initiation in acute pheochromocytoma crisis specifically warns about precipitous hypotension in the first 2 to 4 hours. The standard of care is volume expansion, aggressive crystalloid infusion, not discontinuation of alpha blockade. Reverting to beta blocker monotherapy in a confirmed FeO case with catecholamines at 8 times normal would be contraindicated by every major endocrinology guideline published in the last 15 years. She was not raising her voice. She did not need to. Every word landed with the weight of someone who knew she was risking her residency and had decided to risk it anyway. Wells stared at her. His jaw worked. Behind him, Dr. Price, the cardiologist, was looking at the monitor with an expression that had shifted from panic to something more calculated. He had been writing notes during Dennis's presentation that morning. He had not thrown them away. "She is right about the fluid resuscitation," Price said quietly. "If this is catecholamine-induced vasoconstriction-releasing volume, is the answer not reversal?" Richard Randy was standing in the doorway. He had watched the entire exchange without moving. His wife's blood pressure read 58/32 on the screen above her bed. The number was dropping. Time was a luxury no one in the room could afford. Richard looked at Dennis. His voice came out barely above a whisper, rough and cracking at the edges. "Your wife. She went through this too." Dennis met his eyes. "She did. And the doctors did exactly what Dr. Wells is about to do. They panicked and reversed course. She was dead by morning." Richard closed his eyes. When he opened them, he was looking at the nurses. "Do what he says," Richard said. "Fluids. Keep the current medication. Do it now." Wells opened his mouth to protest. Richard cut him off with a single look, the look of a man who had nothing left to lose and was done asking permission. The nurses moved. 2 liters of normal saline went up on a pressure bag, running wide open into Linda's central line. A 3rd liter was spiked and ready. "Doctor." Brooks positioned herself at the bedside monitor, watching every number her pen tapping against the tablet in a rhythm she did not seem to notice. Dennis stood by the wall. He had done everything he could do. The rest belonged to Linda's body, to the blood flowing through her veins, to the vessels slowly learning to relax after a day of chemical siege, to the kidneys that had been battered but had not yet quit. The minutes stretched. 5, 10, 15. Linda's blood pressure drifted between 55 and 62, too low, dangerously low, but no longer falling. Her heart rate settled into the 90s, still fast, but no longer chaotic. The alarms continued, but the pitch of the room had changed. The frantic energy had given way to something heavier and quieter, the weight of waiting. At the 20-minute mark, the systolic reading climbed to 68, then 72. Nobody spoke. At 30 minutes, it touched 80. Her heart rate dropped to 86. The renal output monitor, which had shown almost nothing for the past hour, registered a small but measurable increase. Dr. Brooks looked up from the screen. Her eyes found Dennis across the room. At 40 minutes, Linda Randy's blood pressure read 94/61. Her heart rate was 78, steady, regular. The catecholamine storm was not over. It would take days to fully stabilize her, and eventually the tumor would need to be surgically removed, but the crisis had broken. The body was responding. The alpha blocker was doing what it was designed to do, and the fluids were giving her circulatory system the volume it needed to function in its newly relaxed state. Linda Randy was going to live. Dr. Price was the first to move. He walked to the whiteboard where 26 hours of wrong diagnoses were still scrawled in red and blue marker, and he quietly erased his own. Dr. Wells left the room without a word. No one called after him. Richard Randy sank into the chair beside his wife's bed, took her hand and pressed it against his forehead. His shoulders shook, but he made no sound. Dennis watched from the doorway for a moment. Then he turned and walked down the corridor past the nurse's station, past the reception desk where he had been turned away that morning through the double doors, and back to the pediatric ward where his daughter was waiting. 4 days later, Linda Randy opened her eyes. The breathing tube had been removed 36 hours earlier. Her kidney function was improving. The endocrinology team had mapped the tumor on imaging a 3-centimeter mass on her left adrenal gland, and surgery was scheduled for the following week. She was weak. Her voice was a thread, but she was alive and she was lucid. And when Richard told her the story of what had happened, all of it from the 31 doctors to the man in the flannel shirt she asked to see him. Dennis came to the VIP suite on a Tuesday afternoon. Mia's crisis had passed 2 days earlier, and she was being discharged the following morning. He had shaved. He was wearing a clean shirt. He stood at the foot of Linda's bed with his hands at his sides, looking deeply uncomfortable in a room that was not designed for people like him. Linda studied him for a long time. She was a woman who had spent 30 years reading boardrooms, measuring the worth of every person who walked through her door in the first 5 seconds. She had built an empire on the ability to see what others missed, and she had almost died because the people around her could not see past a flannel shirt and a pair of work boots. "Richard told me everything," she said. Her voice was thin but clear. "He told me what you did, and he told me what they almost did not let you do." Dennis nodded. He did not seem to know what to do with his hands. "I am told you were a medical student once," Linda said. "A long time ago," Dennis said, "and you left because your wife died." "I left because my daughter needed a father more than the world needed another doctor." Linda looked at him the way she had spent a career looking at problems, not with sentiment, but with precision. Then her expression softened into something Dennis had not expected. It was not gratitude exactly. It was recognition. The recognition of one person seeing another fully for the first time. "Thank you," she said. 2 words. No cameras, no press release, no grand gesture. Just a woman in a hospital bed alive because a man she never would have noticed in any other context had refused to be silent. Dennis nodded once. "I hope your recovery goes well, ma'am." Then he left the room and he did not look back. The next morning, Dennis signed Mia's discharge papers at the pediatric nurses' station. Dolores, the nurse who had been with them since the first night, handed Mia a lollipop and told her to stay out of trouble. Mia promised she would, which both of them knew was a lie. In the elevator going down, Mia tugged on Dennis's sleeve. "Daddy, where did you keep going? When I was sleeping, you kept leaving." Dennis looked down at his daughter. She had her mother's eyes, wide brown, missing nothing. "I went to help somebody," he said. "Somebody who was very sick." "Like me?" Mia asked. "Different kind of sick. But yeah, like you." Mia thought about this. "Did you fix them?" Dennis smiled. It was the kind of smile that held more than one thing at once: relief, exhaustion, grief, and something that might have been the beginning of peace. "I think so, baby. I think so." Mia reached up and took his hand, and they walked out of St. Albans Private Hospital into the gray morning light. 3 weeks later, Dr. Sarah Brooks opened her email at the start of a night shift and found a message with the subject line, "Proposal Diagnostic Failure in Pheochromocytoma, a Case for Systematic Screening Reform." The sender was Dennis Hill. The proposal was 12 pages long, meticulously researched, and cited 47 peer-reviewed sources. It outlined a framework for improving pheochromocytoma detection rates in emergency and critical care settings, with a particular focus on cases where the initial presentation mimicked more common conditions. It was not the work of a doctor. It was the work of a man who had lost someone and decided that the losing would mean something. Dr. Brooks read it twice. Then she forwarded it to the hospital's research committee with a single line added at the top, "This deserves to be heard. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications, because stories like Dennis's remind us that the right voice at the right time can save a life." See you in the next one.